Welcome, everyone, to the onpoli podcast. I'm Steve Paikin.
And I'm John Michael McGrath.
Today on The Pause, booze just can't stay out of the headlines. LCBO employees are threatening to strike, and they've got their sights set on liberalized corner store alcohol sales.
We'll have an update on Ontario Place's legal challenges and the Ontario Science Centre's $1 million business case.
And we look for signs of spring, a spring election, that is, including some fighting words from the official opposition.
In Your Column, My Column, I look at the debate around Canada's economic performance over the last 20 years.
And I've got the spotlight on a Toronto by-election happening on Monday, which, depending on how it goes, could determine the Prime Minister's future or not.
It's Friday, June 21st, 2024, so let's get to it.
Hey, partner, good day.
Hello, sir.
I am wearing my Ticats jersey today, in part because it was home opener this past week, and I know you were watching it on TV, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Anyway, Ticats lost the home opener at Tim Hortons Field in Hamilton, which was very sad. Lost it on the very last play of the game, which was not good. And as well, I went to the Red Sox Blue Jay game a couple of nights ago. And as you can hear,
I was there on Tuesday.
You went Tuesday?
Yeah.
You went to a baseball game?
I am a Jays fan.
Wow. Okay. You know the Jays got swept by the Red Sox,
eh? You were going to give me some business on that. I knew.
Anyway, bottom line, 2 games this week. My throat's in pretty rough shape, so apologies for the scratchy throat. All right. Back in the day when this was an audio-only podcast, we occasionally did a thing called the Quote of Note. And we thought it was high time that we brought that back because this week the Premier went somewhere where premiers of Ontario don't normally go. He went way, way, way up north to a place called Greenstone, Ontario, which is a couple of hours northeast of Thunder Bay. A couple of hours northeast of Thunder Bay. That's up there. Let's have a listen here to Ganoogaming Chief Sherry Taylor. Roll it, please, Sheldon.
From the outset, I wanted to be clear that Ganoogaming First Nation is standing here under duress and that we have issued a media release to that effect. Our community is not starting at the same place in the starting line when it comes to Ontario's focus on investments in Greenstone. It is not missed on me that projects that benefit the government of Ontario are taking precedence over the resolution of our state of emergency, and that 7 decades of grievances that we've experienced have not been resolved.
So some context for our viewers and listeners. The provincial government announced this week $2 million in funding for the Indigenous Workforce Development Program and $2 million to construct and maintain a rest stop in the area. This is part of a broader program of connecting more parts of Northern Ontario and some remote First Nations to the provincial highway network. Initially, I had thought that this might be an announcement about expanding or building the mining road to the Ring of Fire.
You weren't the only one who was expecting that.
That's a $1 billion project, at least $1 billion at this point. That was not the substance of the announcement this week. But Chief Taylor's words, I think, were something of a rebuke to the government. Premier Ford has said, he would drive the bulldozer himself to get that road to the Ring of Fire built. But, First Nations in Ontario, they have their own priorities, and we heard some of the priorities of the chief there. Her community in a state of emergency and wants to see issues like violence and suicides and drug overdoses in that First Nation resolved, and is a higher priority than access roads.
You and I have seen the Premier do dozens, if not hundreds, of announcements over the 6 years that he's been the Premier of Ontario, and they all roll out essentially the same way. This is the first time I can recall an invited guest at the Premier's news conference essentially reading him the Riot Act while he's standing right there. So lots of guts to the chief.
Saying that she's there under duress is something that I don't think, I certainly not under this Premier, not under the previous one either.
Correct. That's why we call it a quote of note. And with that, we're on to issue 1. 2 Fridays from now, on July 5th, LCBO workers could go on strike. The date was set by the union to avoid affecting the first long weekend of the summer, which of course is Canada Day, the previous weekend. JMM, what's this dispute all about?
Well, predictably, part of the argument is that LCBO workers are looking for wage increases as well as more secure working conditions. Something like 70% of LCBO workers are part-time and don't get benefits, according to the union. But the biggest sticking point, probably not surprising if you've been paying attention to the news, the union wants expanded retail locations within the LCBO system and wants more constraints on alcohol sales outside of the LCBO.
Well, of course, we can still purchase beer at the beer store, and we can get beer and wine in supermarkets, I guess, and they are coming to corner stores if the government has its way. But spirits, what about spirits? The LCBO workers go on strike. What happens then?
Well, this is part of the sticking point. You won't be able to get spirits outside of the LCBO. You can't right now get spirits outside of the LCBO, I guess, except for like buying a glass of something. The LCBO is the monopoly provider of spirits. When there was a threat of a strike in 2013, and we've seen this consistently, the LCBO has said previously that they have contingency plans to serve commercial customers, including bars and restaurants. Bars and restaurants, nevertheless, have said they are very concerned about a strike. Some of them are still recovering from COVID. Some of them say their businesses still haven't recovered, and they're worried that a strike would really just be the death blow for a lot of them. Again, it's not just LCBO stores or even bars and restaurants, because you mentioned supermarkets. Supermarkets and, in theory, corner stores are required under the province's rules to get all of their supply from the LCBO as the wholesaler. So if we haven't had a threatened strike like this before, maybe the LCBO can keep bars and restaurants stocked in a strike condition. It's an open question whether they could keep bars, restaurants, supermarkets, and depending on how long a strike goes, corner stores operating.
It's a long list. I don't think the LCBO's ever had a strike, have they?
I don't believe so.
Yeah, I don't think they have.
No.
Anyway, of course, we remember back a few weeks ago, Doug Ford making a very high-profile announcement about ending the Master Framework Agreement a year early, $225 million to do that, or more if you believe the opposition. How does all of that attempt to liberalize beer and wine sales affect what's going on in this strike? Potential strike.
Well, understandably, OPSU members are concerned about the future of their job security. Just to give a specific case here, there's been a growing sector in alcohol sales of basically like canned cocktails, right? Drinks made out of various spirits. OPSU's position is that the government says that spirits will continue to be sold exclusively through the LCBO, so that drinks made from spirits should also be exclusively sold through the LCBO. They want to keep that business line for their members, but the government's position is that these are generally lower alcohol beverages that are really more analogous to beer and cider, so they should be sold in grocery stores and corner stores. That's just one sort of example of the kind of dispute here between the government and OPSU.
Now, public sector unions arguing for better working conditions and higher salaries and better benefits and whatever, more job security, that's not a new story. No. Nothing new about that. But there is something a little bit distinctive about this story that makes it worth a little extra attention. OPSU is, I guess, in effect, trying to effect a major policy change that's already been announced by the government of the day, that government made as a significant election promise 6 years ago, and something the implementation of which has already begun. So that's tricky. How successful do we think they're going to be at that?
I mean, I do want to say this has been OPSU's longstanding position, both under this premier and even before this premier. The union opposed the expansion of grocery store beer and wine sales under Kathleen Wynne. Before that, they were opposing the expansion of so-called agency stores, where the LCBO basically allows a private store to act as a subcontractor. Lots of those all over rural and northern Ontario. But as they were opened up closer to the GTA, OPSU raised a bunch of flags about that. I think it's kind of obvious that OPSU sees this as at least for the LCBO members, OPSU sees this as an existential question for their workers. They just see this as a threat to their future, their livelihood. Whether they've got a lot of leverage with the government, a strike during the summer at the LCBO. We've seen this story before. It's not something the government wants, but at the same time, the future will just mean that the LCBO will just get weaker and weaker because people will have more retail options. So I don't know.
Yeah, that is often the answer to a lot of things we discuss here. I don't know. We shall see.
It's good to be honest.
Well, right on. The LCBO, I think, takes in about $2.5 billion annually in revenue, which goes directly to the Treasury to be spent on programs, services, etc. The Premier is adamant that under the new liberalized system, the province will realize more income. Do we know if that's in fact true?
Well, if alcohol sales do expand, then sort of mechanically, the government will just collect more tax revenue. The federal government collects a lot of alcohol tax revenue, does not own the LCBO, right? Government doesn't need to own the LCBO to make money from alcohol sales. So there's that side of things. In addition, if you take the government's plan as stated, the LCBO operations will become more and more focused on the sale of spirits and higher, and the LCBO makes more money off of spirits. It's a higher margin product, if you want to put it that way. So in theory, you could see the LCBO become a more profitable enterprise with its existing footprint.
In theory.
Right. The catch here is that if the LCBO is making more money for the province in this system, it's probably because they are shedding locations and jobs.
Well, that's the thing. Let's tell like it is here, because if fewer people are shopping for stuff at the LCBO, the LCBO won't need as many unionized employees or as many locations, theoretically. I mean, that's the nub of the problem, isn't it, for the union?
That's exactly it. And we come back to this again. It's sometimes in politics there are win-win outcomes, and sometimes it's just a hard choice between who's going to win and who's going to lose. And OPSEU, I don't think unreasonably, I already used the word existential here, but they see it as a threat, a fundamental threat to the livelihoods of their members.
Right. I don't like making predictions, mostly because I'm always wrong. So why would you want to go on the record of being an idiot? But I am willing to make a prediction that as we count down to July the 5th, and if there is no agreement in place, we have seen this movie before, right? People start to panic, and they will go out, and there will be incredibly long lineups at the LCBO as people stock up in anticipation of whatever might happen after the 5th of July. So my prediction is, if you want to beat those lineups and you're adamant about getting your booze for the cottage, better get out there now.
Yeah, don't ask about my whereabouts for the 4th of July.
And with that, we're on to issue 2. Let's do an update on Ontario Place and the Ontario Science Centre, because there have been some developments surrounding both attractions over the past couple of weeks. JMM, this is a legal thing now. What's the latest?
Yes, so Ontario Place for All, which is a group that advocates for a more publicly oriented, let's say a more ecological waterfront redevelopment, had its challenge. It had launched a legal challenge, and that challenge was dismissed by the Ontario Superior Court of Justice this week. The group was hoping to force the provincial government to conduct an environmental assessment of the redevelopment of the West Island of Ontario Place, but a law passed by the legislature at the behest of the Tory government shortly after the group's application was filed made that impossible.
That is the Rebuilding Ontario Place Act, I think.
Yes, that's the one exactly. It exempts Ontario Place from the province's Environmental Assessment Act. So the law simply doesn't apply in this case. Norm de Pasquale, who is the co-chair of Ontario Place for All and former NDP candidate, said this ruling sets a terrible precedent for Ontario's public institutions.
Well, whether it does or doesn't, are there any more legal arrows in the legal quiver for this group to play?
I mean, Ontario Place for All says they are reviewing the decision and trying to figure out what next steps they might take. But this looks like a pretty steep hill for them to climb. The decision by the court said that there was, I think they use the legal terminology, it is plain and obvious that this case cannot proceed. There's not really a constitutional limit on the legislature's power here. We're talking about land owned by the province of Ontario, and the question of whether it is subject to Ontario's Environmental Act is entirely a question of what laws Ontario passes, right? There had been some work by various advocates to try and rope the federal government in and either have the prime minister try to throw up roadblocks or involve federal jurisdictions somehow. That didn't really amount to anything. And these days, the federal government at least seems to be backing out of some of its environmental challenges of provincial policy. So at a guess, I mean, you were just saying we don't love to make predictions, but
right.
My read of current events is that no, there's not many legal avenues for Ontario Place for All left.
That's Ontario Place.
Yes.
Which was opened in May of 1971 by Premier Bill Davis. There, I've done my job. I got the Bill Davis reference in. Check, exactly. Let's move on. The Ontario Science Centre. Freedom of Information request by Canadian Press has revealed that the province of Ontario has spent nearly $1 million trying to come up with a business case for moving the Science Centre from its current location in Don Mills down to the waterfront where the Premier would like it. Several companies were given reasonably good-sized contracts to perform various tasks related to this. Any way you look at it, it's a relatively big chunk of change. That's a good-sized contract for a report that the Auditor General said was incomplete. So what do we do about that?
Well, the opposition leaders have understandably had things to say. Official opposition leader Marit Stiles called the whole thing a sham. Liberal MPP for Don Valley East, Adil Shamji, said that the Ford government hired consulting firms just to confirm their own plans. And Green Party leader Mike Schreiner called the cost at this time unjustifiable.
Okay, so the legal action is out of the way. It seems like there is nothing in the way, or let's say less in the way, to Terme, I think that's how they pronounce it, Terme getting that spa built on the waterfront, right?
Well, there's that election that we keep talking about.
Oh, yes, that little thing called an election.
Yes. Yeah. If the province does, in fact, head into a spring election and the Ford government were to lose its current majority in the legislature, there would be a successor government that, I mean, any of the three other parties in the legislature have very different priorities for Ontario Place. And I want to stress that that's also true of other government priorities like Highway 413, right? We have previously, when we've discussed it, said like, if you go 2 years out, Highway 413 might be far enough along that a future government might not cancel it. But that might not be the case if the election starts next spring. So there's potential for a few government priorities here to be interrupted if there's an election and the Ford government is not reelected.
Elections have consequences.
Absolutely.
I think we do say that from time to time. And speaking of elections, let's move on to issue 3. As we discussed last week, there is now rampant speculation that Premier Doug Ford might call an early election next spring to take advantage of his high polling numbers. Now, you don't watch hockey, right? You don't watch. God, okay. You don't watch hockey, so you would not know this, but the PC party has its ads on all the time during the Stanley Cup playoffs. And now the opposition parties are swinging into action. What have they got up their sleeves?
NDP leader Marit Stiles rallied the faithful at a party meeting last weekend, made it clear that if the Premier does in fact call an early election, the official opposition will be ready. Here is some of what she had to say.
So Doug, wherever you are right now, whether it's at the cottage or in the back rooms, making some kind of deal, here's what I have to say to you. If you're going to call an election 2 years early, I'm ready.
That was at, I guess they called a sort of special ad hoc, let's get together and show that we're good to go kind of meeting this last weekend.
Yeah, the provincial council.
Provincial council, that was it, yeah. Okay, so that's the end of, you know what, I'm tempted to go back. Are you telling me you really don't watch any of the Stanley Cup playoffs? You do realize this is like one of the most exciting playoffs in a year. The whole country is captivated by these Edmonton Oilers who were down 3-0 and they've now come back, and but you're not watching any of this.
No, sorry.
Okay. Moving right along. Okay, so that's the NDP. Ontario Liberal leader Bonnie Crombie has asked her party's executive council to speed up its work so that the party can have a full roster of candidates here if there is an election next spring. And we should say they have already appointed a guy by the name, you're smiling still. I just have to call you out on bad behavior. I'm sorry, I just do. They've already appointed a guy named Tom Allison, who has longstanding roots in the party, run some very successful campaigns in the past, like Kathleen Wynn's leadership campaign back in 2013. You will well remember.
Yes.
She was the underdog going into that. Sandra Pupatella was the favorite to win. Tom Allison worked up a strategy to get around that and was successful at the end of the day. The Liberals' electoral urgency rules have been invoked, and that means the party is allowed to streamline the nomination process for candidates. Just a reminder, the Liberal Party constitution does allow the leader the right to appoint 5 out of the 124 candidates that the Liberals will presumably run in the next election. We assume they'll run a full slate. Thursday evening, last night, if you're watching us on television, the Liberals announced their first formally nominated candidate, and that will be, drum roll please, that's Ottawa South's John Fraser, who is the leader of the, I guess it's 9, right? The small unofficial party rump in the Ontario legislature. John Fraser, a member for Ottawa South, he will be nominated. One riding that everybody's going to be keeping an eye on election night, where things are already heating up, is in my hometown of Hamilton. Andrea Horvath's old riding of Hamilton Centre. Tell the people why.
One-time New Democrat, now independent MPP, Sarah Jama, has said that she will run again in Hamilton Centre as an independent if there is a spring election. That said, she has also mentioned that her former party has not engaged with her in any sort of rapprochement or reconciliation. Then she is also not alone. In Algoma, Manitoulin, Michael Mantha said right before the House rose, he said in the legislature that he will also run as an independent. Mantha was expelled from the NDP caucus last year over allegations of workplace misconduct, but he has remained in his seat as the MPP there. The current legislature has a few sitting independents, and they are all going to have decisions to make about whether they run again. It's harder to win a seat as an independent, though not impossible.
Bobby Ann Brady did it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I just want to make a brief reminder for our audience. As of now, we are still talking about a spring election being held under the 2022 riding map. There is no word on whether that will change. The next federal election will have different riding boundaries. Ontario has not yet formally adopted any kind of revisions to its riding map. Some potential for mischief there if the government really wanted to. I mean, the Tories will have the most advanced notice if the government decides that it is going to change the riding map, but we will see.
We like mischief.
It makes our life interesting.
I was just going to say, it's good for our business. And with that, it's on to your column, my column. Okay, it's time now for our regular feature, Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I reminisce about the pieces we wrote for the TVO website, tvo.org, over the past week. What of your offerings would you like to discuss this evening, Red?
Well, we have mentioned Hamilton already in this episode.
We have.
Yes.
Yeah.
We've checked that box. But I spoke with an economist from McMaster University this week about Canada's economic productivity, and it was more interesting than that might make it sound, I think. There has been a lot of talk lately, including from the Bank of Canada, about whether Canada is in a productivity emergency. And that is an important issue because, economists would generally say that, growing our productivity is sort of the foundation of future economic prosperity. But this economist from McMaster that I spoke with this week looked at one of the more fundamental measures of productivity and found that Canada's story is not as bad as it looks if you take out the contributions of the oil sands. Basically, it's not that he's criticizing the oil sands as an industry, but this is just a weird sort of statistical quirk about how much it has taken to bring the oil sands into production versus how much we've actually gotten out of it. And once you take the oil sands out, actually, the productivity growth for Canada over the last 20 years or so is no different statistically than the United States. Now, that's not to say there aren't real problems in our economy that need to be addressed, but I think there is good reason. This economist laid out a very compelling argument that we should question the idea of an economic emergency right now.
That is a view not often heard in this country. Usually it's the opposite.
Well, and that was partly why I wanted to write this thing, because I thought...
Making mischief again. There's that guy McGrath making mischief.
Just a little bit. Yeah. A little bit of macroeconomic mischief. Steve, what about you?
I wanted to shine a light on something that I have always firmly believed, having covered politics for, 2 or 3 years in this country and province, and that is by-elections are an absolutely ironclad, firm way of indicating what the people think about the government of the day. Or they mean nothing at all. The trick, of course, is to know which it is. And the reason, of course, we're talking about this is on Monday, there will be a by-election in the federal riding, this is a federal by-election, of Toronto-St. Paul's, which is where we are right now. This station is in Toronto-St. Paul's. It has been a very safe and reliable seat for the Liberal Party of Canada since 1993. That's a very long time. But this just in. The current Prime Minister's popularity is not what you'd call fantastic at the moment. And if people wanted an easy way to kick the government and show, we want to stick it to them for this, that, or the other thing, defeating the Liberals in St. Paul's would be an easy way to do that. Yep. On the other hand, because it has been so loyally Liberal for a very long time, maybe it's a chance to send Pierre Poilievre a message saying, we don't like the way you practice politics either. So I don't know which way it's going to go, obviously. A bunch of polls out there suggest, I'm not even going to get into it because I think they're all conflicting at the moment and who really knows. It's worth saying that Justin Trudeau's popularity wasn't all that great a year and a half ago when there was a federal by-election in Etobicoke Lakeshore. And the Liberals held that seat anyway. They held it pretty easily. Charles Sousa, the former finance minister for the province of Ontario, won that by-election. So, how's this one going to go on Monday? I don't know. Pundits will certainly have a field day if the Liberals lose this because they will say, aha, if the Liberals can't hold Toronto-St. Paul's, they are in the worst imaginable trouble, and the Prime Minister...
No safe riding anywhere.
Correct, and the Prime Minister ought to step down right away. If, on the other hand, they hang on to it, maybe those pundits are going to have to think about a new line after that. Monday is by-election day, so stay tuned.
The funniest possible outcome is the Liberals lose this by-election. There's turmoil in the Liberal Party. The Prime Minister resigns. They hold a very quick leadership race, and they hold a federal election before Ontario can bring its spring election forward, and all of the planning by the current Premier's office is for naught.
You are in a desperately mischievous mood today, aren't you? This is really something. You're hitting even new highs for you.
I must have had too much caffeine before we started rolling.
I think so. Now, just before, I know we're going to go to the mailbag, but just before we do that, this is the time of the podcast where I occasionally like to give a shout out to people. And I mentioned earlier, I was at the Jays game on Wednesday when the Red Sox swept the Blue Jays, incidentally.
keep causing me pain.
What is wrong with the Blue Jays this year? I'm like $220 million lineup, and they stink. I don't get it. Anyway, that's another issue.
I really should be watching hockey. It would be more entertaining than the Jays.
You'd have more fun.
Games.
You would. Anyway, there's a guy named Blaise Aline who walks up to me at the ball game, and he says, longtime onpoli podcast listener, really appreciated the program during COVID especially. He said we had lots of good and useful information to pass along during COVID.
From my linen closet.
That's right. I was in the attic. You were in the linen closet, yeah. Blaise is very old school. He still listens to the onpoli podcast as opposed to watching us on TV or on YouTube, but that's okay. As the kids say, Blaise, we appreciate you. So that's all good. Over to you, sir.
All right, let us get to the mailbag.
If you've got a burning question or insightful comment, please send it along to onpolitics@tvo.org. Our last episode of this season will be next Friday, June 28th, and that final show will be a mailbag episode where we're going to answer all of your burning on-poly questions. So please send us your questions once again to onpolitics@tvo.org. And this time, we have some incentive for you to weigh in.
That's right. Anyone who submits a question between now and June 25th will be entered to win one of 3 copies of this book, Great Small Towns of Ontario by Richard Petty. Steve is also interviewing him on the agenda on Monday, June 24th, so make sure to watch that.
Exactly. I got to say, I quite enjoyed this book. Richard focuses on what, in his view, are the best kind of small towns in Ontario, sort of 25,000 population at least. So 3 people will do the draw live on next week's program, and 3 people will get a free copy of the book as we draw the names based on, of course, the emails that we receive from you. So shall we get to the letters?
All right, let's get to our first
fire
question.
away.
This is an email from listener Ron from Stittsville, who writes, Hi, Steve and JMM. My question and entry for the Ontario Travel Book is related to travel in Ontario. There is another podcast that believes in always read the plaque. I think he's referring to 99% Invisible, which is a great podcast. In traveling around Ontario, I frequently see signage pointing out landmarks, historic places, and plaques. What agency is responsible for these signs? Is there a list/map for them online? Plaques are inherently a product of their time and politics, so I am curious. A great podcast and enjoy your summer. Ron from Stittsville.
Ron, thank you for that. So let's say in 1956, a group called the Archaeological and Historic Sites Board of Ontario began placing all these plaques around Ontario that you see. And I think we all know them. You know, when we're driving on the back roads of the province, there are these sort of blue plaques with gold embossed writing on them. They're very distinctive looking. That agency is now known as the Ontario Heritage Trust. We talked about them a couple of weeks ago with the Premier's Gravesite program, and it falls under the Ministry of Citizenship and Multiculturalism. They have erected nearly 1,300 signs around the province and 22 signs internationally as well.
One imagines that's like birthplaces of prime ministers. Or
Yeah, right
that
on,
kind of thing.
right on.
Yeah. You can search for plaques on heritagetrust.on.ca, and I think we've got a board here. This is an example of what you can find. This is the entry for St. Anne's Anglican Church, which unfortunately was lost to a fire last week.
Terrible.
We will put some links in the episode description so that our viewers can take a look for themselves. Any memorable plaques that you've seen in your life, Steve?
Absolutely. Tons of them, actually, but I'm going to highlight just one right here. You may remember a man by the name of Robert Nixon, who was four times the leader of the Ontario Liberal Party. And I and a bunch of other onpoli nerds, usually a couple of times a year, drive down to Paris, Ontario, and go visit 95-year-old Mr. Nixon, who is still in great shape and doing really, really well. We've actually got, you know what? We've got a visit planned tomorrow. We've got a visit planned tomorrow, now that I think of it. We're going to drive down and see him. So I will report back to you next weekend, on next week's podcast, rather. Mr. Nixon is from a very political family. His father, Harry Nixon, was the Premier of Ontario in 1943. Mr. Nixon himself was the Treasurer, the Minister of Finance in David Peterson's government from 1985 to 1990. His father got elected in Brant riding in 1919 and held that seat all the way through to 1960. He died in office. He's the longest-serving MPP ever, Harry Nixon. Almost 43 years, I think. He died in office. Bob Nixon, his son, won the by-election to replace him. So between father and son at Queen's Park, they represented Brant riding and all the different names it had over the years from 1919 to 1991. Wow. 72 straight years, father and son. I'm not done, because Bob Nixon's daughter, Jane Stewart, represented the same area federally when Jean Chrétien was prime minister. So 3 generations. About a decade ago, the Ontario Heritage Trust put one of its blue signs on Highway 5, just west of Hamilton, on the roadside next to Mr. Nixon's home, where he lived and where his parents lived before him. And we've got a picture of it right here. And the sign says, "In recognition of 3 generations of the Nixon family who represented the residents of the county of Brant between 1919 and 2004, both provincially and federally, this portion of Highway 5 is being designated the Nixon Way." So I think that's kind of cool. Yeah. And I guess, yes, if pushed to come up with one, that would be my favorite Heritage Trust blue and gold sign in the province of Ontario. How about you?
I don't have a favorite of the actually formal official Ontario Heritage Trust plaque. There is, however, the Toronto Recursive History Project of Toronto Recursive History.
What?
Has put out a plaque that you can sometimes find in the wild in Toronto about how the joy of this particular plaque is that it marks the history of plaques.
That is kind of hysterical.
It's a bit of fun, and if you see it out in Toronto, you see them every once in a while. My father saw one recently, reminded me of its existence, and I always get a bit of a chuckle when I see them.
That is kind of adorable. Okay, let's move on here. Sheldon, can we bring the next one up? Here's an email from listener Diana Stevenson. Diana emails us from time to time, and she writes, "What are your thoughts about the frivolous notion of cardless IDs being proposed by Premier Ford? I am in total opposition. Not everyone has a digital device. Many seniors, being computer illiterate, would find this difficult to deal with. Your discussion is appreciated. Diana Stevenson. Okay, what do you say?
So this is a government proposal from a few years back to allow people to put their driver's license and health cards in their Apple wallets, their Google wallets on their smartphones. As Diana mentions, accessibility is one obvious question that came up. Even people who have smartphones may not be comfortable or able to use the software wallets that these phones have. People have totally valid concerns about privacy and security. Just me personally, if I were driving and I were pulled over by a police officer, I would have some reservations about handing them my phone as opposed to just handing them my
a piece of paper or
my driver's license,
laminated license. Yeah.
But the arguments for this system, to give it its due, are that people might find it more convenient. I do sometimes leave my house without my wallet. I almost never leave my house without my phone, right? There's that kind of idea, and that in some ways these digital IDs could actually have stronger privacy protections than standard physical forms. All of that said, the Information and Privacy Commissioner of Ontario had weighed in on this issue and said that a digital ID should be optional, certainly not mandatory. And in any event, the government seems to have backed off of this idea because certainly many conservatives found there were all sorts of feelings about the government tracking people and some sort of leftover, let's say, resentment about vaccine mandates, that kind of thing.
I saw the quote in the Toronto Star about this. Some Tory backroom guy quoted as having said, "Our base hates this idea."
Yes.
So, bottom line, this is going to be optional. No one's proposing to get rid of the laminated, old-fashioned driver's licenses.
Certainly not right now. And indeed, the government just doesn't seem to be pursuing this with any vigor right now.
Gotcha. Okay. Finally, let's do an email here from listeners James and Francis Oliver as they write on the upcoming and potential elections. Here we go. My wife and I think Steve Paikin and John Michael McGrath should be our next Premier and Prime Minister. We seniors enjoy your Friday program. Sincerely, Jim and Francis Oliver.
Lovely sentiment, but speaking for myself, I'm a carless weirdo cyclist who has advocated in writing for things like road tolls, so I think I'm basically unelectable.
Yeah, you got that right. What does one say here? If nominated, I will not stand. If elected, I will not serve.
Yes, the Sherman statement. Yes.
Jim and Francis, I thought you liked us. Why would you want to inflict those? Anyway, that's kind of adorable, but. Let's do one more here. A quick shout out to listener David Harrison, who wrote in after we answered his email to say that he loved my T-shirt last week. This was the one that you commented on as well.
Yes.
This is the one where you're going up the 400 highway and you get to that interchange where if you go one way, you're off to Orillia, North Bay. If you go the other way, you're off to Parry Sound and Sudbury. David has a kid who lives in Sudbury. So as always, David, thank you very much for listening. I say listening because we haven't quite got David watching yet. He's still old school. He's just listening.
We love our listeners too, though.
That's okay. That's right. That's okay.
Once again, if you'd like to ask anything about the content on the show or on politics in general, please email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And that is the On Poly podcast for this June 21st, 2024.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Any feedback you have, we're happy to hear it, good, bad, or indifferent. Write us an email. You know the address, onpolitics@tvo.org. Be sure to include your first and last name and where you're located.
This week's episode was produced and edited by Matthew O'Mara. Welcome back, Matthew.
How about that? Can we say that? Can we just pause for a second to say, Matthew, we have missed you. Matthew's been off on paternity leave for the last few months. We have missed him. Matthew, you need a haircut. I just saw you in the control room. You need a haircut. But we're absolutely thrilled that Maeve has entered your world and I guess ours as well. And it's thrilling to have you back. So great job, buddy.
Wonderful. Welcome back.
Yeah.
Video editing by Colin Kish.
Production support on this from Jonathan Hallowell, Christine Gardner, Carla Lucetta, and TVO's Digital Media Services team.
Our managing editor is Katie O'Connor. Laurie Few is the executive producer of Digital. Stacey Dunseith is executive producer of The Agenda. John Ferry is vice president of programming and content.
Special thanks to our wonderful studio crew for making the video podcast happen. And this week, we're going to single out David Chung, who's back there on camera too, God willing, keeping me in focus. Thank you, David. Well done. And until next Friday, everybody, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.